Welcome back to yet another video. Today we are going to discuss on one of the topic which normally every developer, Spring Boot developer basically, who faces an issues around when he is working on a Spring Boot application and around it, right? So sometime what happens that your application doesn't get started. Okay, so uh, here I will try to let you all know like what how to troubleshoot it, right, and what is the issue about it, and also I will guide you by step how you can actually resolve it, or there is a solution for it, right? So without wasting time, let's get into the video. So Spring Boot application, now if you've been dealing with or working with Spring Boot application, there are many reasons. uh, there are multiple uh, failing points where the application doesn't get up, right, and it depends on different errors and different symptoms, right? So troubleshooting is really difficult. uh, so I'm just trying to make a video where actually I can help people to understand what are the things to look out, and if such error comes, what are the things to be checked and looked for. So if you are working with Spring Boot application and your application is not getting started, you might have to first look at the error logs, right? So these are the I would say common logs. So the very first thing is that you have to look at the logs, right? So Spring application actually logs out, extensive logs during this particular startup. They often be, that is very helpful, right? So it will give you like what went wrong. You can find logs in the console output file or a file it has been configured. So you have to check out for the configuration where these particular logs are getting generated. Okay, check out the log levels which has been added in your application. So check for the console logs during your application setup. You'll get all those details and the test stack trace. Now look for error, like your application might be enabled with error warning or exception messages. Okay, so Spring Boot will give you some specific classes or a line number where the failure has occurred, right? So you should dig down to that particular location and scroll that particular cost by basically, so you'll get to know what exactly is the issue. So there are like exceptions to name of some of the few exceptions or some names, right? What might be the possibility? This may not be the whole list, but some of them I've listed it out. So bean creation exception. So what, when you're dealing with Spring and then dependency injection or startup of your application, right? So there might be an issue which where there is a problem with the creation of the bean. So that is due to like incorrect configuration, or there are some missing dependencies. So that might be one of the exception which is thrown. Okay, so I'll just search with exception view in the log file. You will be able to get that. Okay, now application context exception. So this will actually is an issue which when you are loading the sprint context, right? So this would be like missing some configuration, or you have misconfigured some beans. So in that case, your application context exception throws up. Okay, data source exception. This is often related to the database connection which we are trying to establish with some database. So there might be some wrong credential, there might be some missing database URL, or it might be an incorrect URL you have configured, right? Or the port number is not properly configured. So just check out for those particular exceptions. You'll really find stack trace, and then you'll whichever what is the cause of that particular exception. Now no such bean definition exception. This also occurs when Spring basically in the container it is not able to find that particular bean which is required by the some classes, right? So when it is trying to load that particular classes, it will not be able to find that particular bean. So these are the common errors which we have to at the start in the log files we have to check out for, where you can make that particular starting point to dig down more into what might be the possibility and what might be the error. Now apart from what we have checked out in the log files, there are what you have to check is that we have to check the dependencies and the configuration. Now Spring Boot actually plays a lot with the dependencies and the libraries. So whatever in the pom.xml you mentioned, those dependencies and the things will be loaded up. So dependency injection, which is now if you have been working with Spring Boot, right? Dependency system is like uh, it's a tightly sometime it is like very tightly configured with your configuration, right? So misconfiguration of a dependencies, and there are some conflicting versions which might often cause for the startup failure. So that is the reason which the failure happens. Now what you have to do is that we have to ensure the dependencies are included in the pom.xml. So if you are working with Maven, ensure that you are adding that particular dependencies. Okay. Now if you are aware of starter dependencies, the Spring Boot starter dependencies like Spring Data, JPA, web, or database related, make sure that dependencies are compatible with your version which you have mentioned in the Spring Boot. Okay. So ensure you don't have a conflicting version in the dependencies tree. So the tools like MVN dependency tree, or if you're working with Gradle, there is a dependency to check, right? So you also deal with profile based configuration. Now your application is running in the dev environment, then always check for the dev properties. If you are running in the production environment, check for the production properties. So there might be something which is missing up. There might be some wrong setting you have done in your current configuration. So make sure you check which is an active profile and also the configuration which are correctly configured. So in application.properties or in the application, you have to enable that particular dev profile, or when you are running your Java using the command line, right? You can activate that particular profile using that active uh, key value pair. After that, if this particular check is done, so the next step is that you have to check for the database connections. Now one of the common reason the Spring Boot application fail is that there are some database connection issues. So incorrect database credential, missing drivers, unavailable of database servers can cause the application to start up during the, it fail during the startup of the application. Now what you can do is that you can check the database URL, you can check the username and password in the application.properties or YML, whatever it is configured in your class path. So ensure that all these particular properties, every key whatever you have mentioned is correct, and along with that you have to mention those particular value as well as in correct which is configured. Now check the database server itself is running, or it is available or not, or accessible to it, right? Because if that is not enabled and available, you will not be able to make a connection. So before you make your application up, try to telnet or test your connectivity with some other tools like DBview or any other database tools where you can actually connect to the database and see whether you are able to make a successful connection. Now, if you are using JPA, ensure that you have properly mentioned the dialect in that particular for your database, because dialects plays a very important role when you are dealing with multiple database, and especially when you are dealing with Spring Data JPA. So, if you are using Spring, let's say MySQL, so make sure that it is configured to a correct dialect of MySQL. Okay. Now Spring Boot sometime might also fail when you are it is trying to initialize the database connection if a schema or a table is not found also, right? So ensure your database schema is present, and also tables are present, also like the column is present, right? So if you are using JPA, so set your this create drop, right? So it will ensure that all the tables are created from the startup of your application. But there is a provision where you can also make it to update, where it doesn't want your application to be created when your application is getting started. If it is already there, it will not create it. Okay. So that's the way for the dev team environment, but for production you might have different configuration. After this, you have to review your properties or the application configuration files. Now there is some missing or incorrect properties you have mentioned in your YML or the property files, which can actually cause your application to start up, or there is some unexpected behavior happening. Now you Spring Boot actually basically heavily rely on this particular property files. which enables them to configure your database connection, the port details, the security configuration settings. So you have to check for the any typos of the property name. There is a spelling mistake of the server or a port, or there is some space or something actually it is there. So majorly like it happens like your application is already started earlier, and you sometime or due to the application problem or due to some Windows problem or any of this OS problem, you are not able to shut down that particular port. So you have to check if there is any other service already running on that particular port. Apart from like you can also configure the default 8080, but if it is specifically if you have configured to some port, it might fail due to if it is already running on that. So try making that particular change in that particular property file if it is some port is already occupied or if you are not able to shut down that. So reconfigure that particular port, you can reconnect it and your application will be up. Now if you are using Spring Security, you have to ensure that there is a necessary security related configuration such as username, password, and other delete details which are required for Spring Security. Now Spring version, Java version and Spring version as well, it plays a very important role. Now you have to ensure that your Java version is correct in the form.xml, and so you have to specifically your Spring Boot version is compatible with your Java version. That has to go in hand, because you cannot have a Spring Boot latest version, let's say 3x, and then you cannot have your configuration below 7 or 8, right? So that will be a totally mismatch and your application won't be up, because everything depends on this particular form.xml configuration, and you will actually configure those particular property dependencies based on that. So always check your Java and Spring Boot version. So you have to always check for the unsupported version which might not be compatible to it. So you can actually check like what version on computer, what version like Java version it is there. Okay, in the form.xml you can check for your property file where it mentions java.version. Now after all this, you have to check for the Spring Beans if there are some common issues which are arising in the Spring Boot application, which is causing failure to create certain beans. Now this might be an incorrect annotation which you have mentioned. There is a conflicting bean which is with the names, or there is a cyclic or a circular dependency which is causing that problem. So always check for @component scan issues which classes are not being scanned up because they are outside the default base package. So always check for the package where this particular classes are mentioned and it is correctly configured. So check for the circular dependencies in the bean, like let's say A dependent on B and B is dependent on A. Then you have to detect that particular infinite loop, and then you have to apply your solution of cyclic dependency. There are many forums or videos available where you can actually solve this particular dependency equation. You have to either deal with the lazy at the rate lazy annotation, or you can go for the setter annotations where you have to first uh, uh, exclude that particular construction injection at the startup of that, and then deal with that particular setter way of doing that. So in that way you can also consider using at the rate primary and at the rate or a qualifier at the rate qualifier, which will give you like if there are multiple beans of same type as well. Now running in the debug mode, this is quite important, and every developer should definitely have this particular skills to debug, because this is an initial skill set which is required to try or to see what might be the issues, because no matter like there will be nothing smooth. You have to face some issues and then challenges, and then you'll get experience of like this might be the issue, and then how can resolve it. So uh, the more you are able trying to make your application up and run, make it run, and you will be able to see or deal with this particular issue. So debug mode plays a quite important role when it comes to giving you a detailed information about like application context and beans, and this will also identify the runtime to identify those particular wiring or missing dependencies issues as well. So You have to enable your debug mode in the application.properties, or you can also make it using the command line argument. So just check out your configuration which has got debug is equal to true, or what you can do is that when you are running your application with the command line, you can run it by the hyphen debug mode, right? So this will make your application in the debug up. So that's will you'll get more details about. Now there is an actuator which it's not mandatory, but that it's good to have, and it will give you an endpoints where you can actually monitor, you can troubleshoot your application. It will enable like what are the end, there are certain endpoints which will give you some health related some metrics as well, and then overall health of your application, and also it will give you a lot of information about the runtime information. So in order to do that, what you can do is that you can add the starter dependency for actuator, and you can configure in the properties file to expose certain endpoints. So there are, as I mentioned, there is a health one which will give you a total current health of your application, etc. So make sure you have this particular configuration enabled. Now we can also, if you're dealing with any third-party integration, let's say you're dealing with Kafka, Rabbit, and Cube, right? So you are integrating your application with that particular third-party services. So check for message broker, and just check for the connection which are there. The configuration of their own Kafka-related things or Rabbit and Cube. Their configuration are properly mentioned. There is no spelling mistake. So ensure your credential is correct. There is a security configuration, there are properly URL being mentioned. So there is always a problem when you are trying to connect with the third party services, right? So there might be your application service is down, so service is not available. Yeah, so that's the reason. If it is not handled properly in your application, application will not start. uh, Lastly, you have to test your application locally and your environment. If your application works locally but it is failing in your production, let's say, so you have to check this environment specific related configuration. So that might be some network issue which is not enabled, there are some firewall related which is not enabled, there is some missing configuration or the variable. So you might have configured in your dev environment, but when it comes to the production environment, these particular properties might not be enabled or added in the, or that is a missed in the properties of the production. So that will definitely fail your applications in that particular environment, because in your local environment you have dealt with those particular, because it was started, then you get too many chances to make your application up, but in the production it will not give you, it has to be started up in the limited time. I hope this video was helpful to you in many ways, and also it gives you an insight of how to approach when there is certain startup failure of your application. So nothing to worry about it, just you need to have step by steps things to be followed, what needs to be taken care of. If this video was helpful, please share it with the needy people, also hit the bell icon and also share it with the other peoples.